The Caribbean in the 17th century was not a paradise. Forget white sand and cocktails. Back then it was heat, disease, hunger, and blood. It was a world where governments sent criminals and desperate men to carve out colonies, where merchants sold people like cattle, and where navies hunted each other across the waves. It was chaos on water, and from that chaos crawled one of the most deranged killers ever to touch a ship. His name was François l'Olonnais, and he wasn't just a pirate, he was a walking horror story. L'Olonnais didn't start out powerful. He started as nothing. Poor, anonymous, one of thousands of Frenchmen shoved across the Atlantic as cheap labor. His early life was humiliation. He was beaten, starved, enslaved, and left for dead. Most men collapsed under that kind of life. Most men faded into silence. But l'Olonnais didn't collapse. He hardened. He took all that pain and let it ferment inside him until what came out wasn't Tiaman anymore. It was something cruel, something twisted. He stopped thinking about survival and started thinking about revenge. Not survival, not money, but revenge. And when he finally escaped that life and grabbed hold of a ship, the Caribbean got its first real taste of what lived inside him. Other pirates wanted gold, wanted rum, wanted whores in Havana. L'Olonnais wanted screams. He didn't plunder to get rich, he plundered to make people suffer. His raids were nightmares performed live, with fire, blood, and terror as his favorite props. When he boarded a Spanish ship, the crew prayed not for survival but for a quick death. They knew that if he wanted information, he wouldn't bargain, he wouldn't threaten. He would take his knife and carve the answers into existence. One story says he captured dozens of Spaniards and demanded to know which road led to the city he planned to sack. When they hesitated, he lined them up and hacked them apart one by one, spilling guts onto the sand, until one survivor finally broke and begged for mercy with directions. That was how he worked. Torture wasn't a last resort, it was the opening act. And when he was finished, he would throw back his head and laugh. The sound cutting across the open sea like a cannon blast, bouncing off the sails and the creaking timbers of the pirate ship, chilling the bones of every man aboard. His most infamous act has been told so many times it sounds like a campfire legend, but it's real. He captured a group of Spaniards, asked them to talk, and when they refused, he decided to make an example. He sliced one man open, ripped out his beating heart with his bare hands, and bit into it. Human flesh chewed in front of terrified prisoners. He wanted them to see that he was something worse than human. He wanted them to believe he was a demon in the flesh, a living storm of fire and shadow, a terror that prowled the decks and haunted every dark corner, leaving no doubt that crossing him meant facing something beyond human, something that could not be reasoned with or escaped. And it worked. The prisoners screamed, the story spread, and his reputation turned into a weapon sharper than any blade. The Spanish gave him a title, the Flail of the Indies. Not a man, but a scourge, a punishment sent from hell itself. Mothers whispered his name to scare children into silence. Soldiers spoke of him around fires, as if saying his name too loudly might summon him from the shadows. To be captured by l'Olonnais wasn't a risk, it was a guarantee of torment. Death was a mercy he rarely gave. People didn't just fear him, they despised him, hated him, prayed for some divine power to erase him from the earth. But until that day came, they ran. And yet, through all this, men followed him. Not because they loved him. No pirate ever loved his captain. They followed because they were more terrified of him than the enemy. Fear was his currency, and he was rich. Ships would surrender without a fight at the mere sight of his black sails, a symbol of death cutting across the horizon, sending crews scrambling in terror, knowing that resistance meant certain doom under his merciless command. Whole towns would evacuate at the rumor of his approach. He didn't need cannons when he had reputation. That was his genius. He weaponized madness, and his crew, trapped by his rage, helped him build a floating empire of fear. Here's the irony. François l'Olonnais wasn't even good at being a pirate in the traditional sense. He didn't gather massive treasure like Bartholomew Roberts. He didn't control ports like Henry Morgan. He didn't turn piracy into business like Blackbeard. He burned treasure as easily as he burned towns. He left behind no gold, no maps, no legacy of wealth. All he left was carnage. He was less a pirate, more a serial killer with sails. But somehow that was enough. Fear is more powerful than gold. Fear lasts longer than coins. And L'Ollonais turned fear into his brand. But legends like this don't last. The ocean that had fed him finally turned against him. One raid too many, one storm too hard, and his ship wrecked off the coast of Honduras. The monster who had commanded whole towns to tremble was suddenly just a man, stranded, exposed and desperate, and the people who found him. They knew exactly who he was. His reputation had sailed ahead of him. They knew the stories of burned towns, of butchered families, of prisoners dragged screaming into the darkness and left to die. Tales that spread like wildfire and turned every harbor into a place of trembling silence at the mere mention of his name. And they weren't interested in trials. They weren't interested in ransoms, they wanted blood. Dragged into the jungle, the butcher became the victim. This time there were no screaming prisoners, no Spanish soldiers begging for their lives. It was L'Ollonais who begged. The locals tore him apart piece by piece. Some say they hacked him with machetes, others that they burned him alive. One account claims they cut him into strips and roasted him. However it happened, the result was the same. The man who had turned cruelty into theater ended up as the star of his own final performance, ripped to pieces in front of an audience that had waited far too long for justice. His story ended in 1630 when he died in France. He lived for 38 years. François L'Ollonais, the heart-eater, the scourge of the Indies, the nightmare in boots, was reduced to nothing but meat in the jungle. No treasure, no glory, just bones scattered in the dirt, a silent testament to the horrors he left behind, and a warning that his shadow still haunted the seas long after he vanished. His legend didn't die, but his body sure as hell did. He thought fear would make him immortal. Instead, fear dragged him down and devoured him. His cruelty came back around, and in the end, it wasn't the Spanish Navy, it wasn't the governor of Havana, it wasn't another pirate that destroyed him. It was ordinary people who had had enough. That's what makes him fascinating. Blackbeard with his smoking beard gets painted as the face of piracy. Captain Kidd with his trial in London is remembered as the unlucky privateer. But L'Ollonais, he's different. He wasn't clever, he wasn't rich, he wasn't even sane. He was raw brutality, the human equivalent of a horror film. And maybe that's why his story lingers. He wasn't a pirate to be admired or envied. He was a pirate to be feared, to be hated, to be whispered about in trembling voices. A nightmare made flesh who turned the ocean into his kingdom of terror. The kind of story that keeps you up at night, wondering how someone like that could really exist. And the scariest part? He did exist. He walked, he killed, he laughed, and he died in pieces. So when you hear the romantic versions of piracy, the treasure maps, the buried gold, the tavern songs, remember there was another side. A side drenched in blood. A side where men like François L'Ollonais turned the Caribbean into hell on water. He wasn't a pirate. He was a nightmare that sailed. But history has even darker leaders hiding in the shadows. Stick around and subscribe. Let's uncover them together. Because history isn't dead stories, it's real horror. And sometimes the monsters wear crowns. Thank you for watching.